Recognized.
Thank you. I would just respond to a couple of points my colleague from Vermont referred to. If I recognize the votes on everything that has come to the Senate thus far, I think the lowest vote total was 221. 221 is a majority of the House, and the majority of the House spoke. What we do with it is our business here in the Senate. So it's not necessarily a minority of the minority. If it were, you wouldn't have 221 votes. That's the first point I'd make. The second thing, I don't know what the Texas Republican Party's platform is, but yours truly has thought that one of the things we ought to do for veterans is to give them real health care rather than promise them health care and then make them travel 200 miles to get it. And so part of privatization is giving veterans who have service-connected health care available to them a card that says you can go wherever you want, so that you don't have to travel, like in Oklahoma, if you're going to have a knee operation, 145 miles to the VA center in Oklahoma City. You could actually get it done by an orthopedist that has a whole lot more experience in a local hospital paid for at Medicare rates. So the point is there are options that will give our veterans better access than what they have now. I don't know if that's what they're talking about, but that was part of the Patient's Choice Act that was never considered by the Senate. I wanted to spend some time talking about where we are and why we're here, and then I want to talk about the continuing resolution, whether it has something attached to it or not. As I look at the process, what I see is stuck on a principle that has been true throughout our nation. When you do big things in government, the only way those things are successful is when they're done in a bipartisan manner. To quote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that if in fact historic laws don't pass barely, this is his quote, they pass 70-30 or they fail. They either fail in implementation or they fail in acceptance by the American public. I applaud the vigor of my friends in opposing the Affordable Care Act. As a practicing physician, I see what this is ultimately going to do. And as the majority leader has spoken, the whole idea behind this, and I think my colleague probably from Vermont would concur, for a single-payer government system as a better solution. Certainly what we had wasn't working well. I would not disagree with that. But having a bipartisan health care bill rather than a strictly partisan health care bill has probably instigated a lot of the problems that we have with this bill, besides the fact that over 62% of the American public is not in favor of this bill. They don't want the government shut down over it. That's obvious. But we are where we are. And one of the reasons we are where we are is, I think, failed leadership, both by Republicans and Democrats. And a polarization in our country that is not healthy for our country. So we now sit with 800,000 employees on furlough, having a real but small negative effect on our economy. And what has to happen when you have people far apart? What you have to have is leadership that says, I'm going to try to solve this problem by brokering it towards the middle. Now, I don't know what that middle is. But what I haven't seen yet in the leadership, including the president, is a willingness to find the common ground that will move us in a direction that puts us where we need to be. You know, the thing we forget too often in the Senate is that we're all Americans. Every one of us. What we do up here matters. It has profound effects on individuals' lives. And the fact that we find ourselves unable to come to a consensus on this very difficult subject is what happens when you have an absence of leadership. So it is great that the president is meeting or has met with the leaders of the House and the Senate. It would be great if they spent time working on a solution rather than giving press reports after the meeting. It would be good for all Americans if we were not in a government shutdown. The very premise is that you can get the president and those that have foisted the Affordable Care Act, which I think will be highly unaffordable for our children and us, to change this law at this time is probably not going to happen. But there has to be a way for a continuation of dialogue rather than to say we won't consider anything. And so the House today is going to offer up several bills that will actually take care of very great necessities of this country. And it would be unfortunate if we don't consider them. Now, we can vote them down, but not considering is not talking, is not reaching across and trying to find a solution. It's hardening positions. And I would think that the American people would want us to take a time out and say, what are you doing? What is your job? You know, I recently got a letter from the Liberty Foundation of America by a man I greatly respect, Dr. David Brown, renowned orthopedist in Oklahoma. And what he's saying to people in America today is a recognition of the failure of our leadership. And I'd like to insert his letter into the record because they make—
Objection, so ordered.
He makes some profound observations about where we are and the lack of leadership. Now here's a practicing orthopedist who loves his country, who wants us to solve the problems, who wants us to take back control of our government and do the things that are in the best long-term interest of the country, not what is in the best long-term interest of a politician or a political party. And I think that's where we've gotten off. Everything's measured by the next election rather than by the next generation. And although I don't always agree with my colleagues, most of them know I'm willing to work and compromise and meet as long as we're attaining long-term good goals for our fellow countrymen and for our children. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the CR itself, because lost in all this battle is a CR that plays a lot of games on the American people. And it's disappointing for me to see that we play games with mandatory spending by moving numbers from one year to the next year so that we can actually spend more money in a present year. I didn't vote to have a sequester because I think it's an idiotic way to cut spending. But I do support trimming the spending of the federal government. Matter of fact, nobody in the last 9 years has done more to offer amendments, to outline duplication, to outline fraud, to outline abuse than I have on the floor of the Senate. So it's one thing to do it stupidly, it's a wholly another to actually keep your commitments to the American people. And the vast majority of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle voted for the Budget Control Act, as did most Republicans. So we have a commitment to keep our word. And so I would outline to you that first of all, make 2 points. One is that we're not keeping our word with the continuing resolution coming from the House. It actually will spend $38 billion more than what we promised the American people we would spend. And I know in Washington, $38 billion isn't a large amount of money, but the way you get rid of $1 trillion deficits is $1 billion at a time, or $38 billion at a time. So I'm disheartened that we're playing the green eye shade and walnut shell game on the American people with this bill. And just to make my point, I'd like to outline some of the spending and some of the false maneuvers that have been done in what's called CHIMPs, which are changes in mandatory programs. We have a program in the United States called the DOJ Assets Forfeiture Fund. And this is funds that the Justice Department collects that are forfeited by criminals, by people breaking the law, whether it be a car in a drug bust or the money from a drug bust. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that money out of that fund, which it goes back towards things that actually enforce our law enforcement, and plus that down, in other words, steal that money so we can spend more money somewhere else. And that's just $723 million. It's almost $1 billion. More concerning to me is the fact that there's a victim compensations fund in this country. And that's where criminals pay into a fund to compensate victims. There's $8.9 billion in that fund, supposedly. But last year, the appropriators did exactly the same thing. They took that $8.9 billion, said they'd pay it back this year, and they were allowed to spend almost $9 billion more on other things and take that money that should have been given to victims and spend it through the federal government. Lo and behold, they didn't add the $8.9 billion back this year. They counted the same thing again. So now we have $19 billion of not taxpayer money, but criminal money that should be going to victims that's now going to be spent on other things, and the victims will not receive the money that is due them through either court orders or judgments. Finally, there's a lot of spending in this bill that most Americans would see as foolish. And I thought I'd outline just a little bit of it. Oh, one other point I'd make. U.S. Patent and Trademark Office collects fees when you file a patent. And for years, they have been falling further and further behind. Thankfully, they got caught up. But the money that's paid for a patent application has been siphoned off, not for patent applications, but for spending on other things. It's a user fee. And consequently now it's over 8 months if you file a patent before somebody ever even looks at that at the patent office. And it's 27 months before you get a response. If we're going to get ahead and compete in this competitive world, we've got to allow our patent office to work. And they're taking hundreds of millions of dollars from the Patent and Trademark Office. Now, what does the CR spend money on that we really shouldn't? Now, here's some examples for last year that we spent money on that we shouldn't. Funding from the National Science Foundation for the development of a snooky, a robot bird that impersonates a female sage grouse. Funding an National Science Fund grant that studies American attitudes towards the filibuster in the Senate. An NSF grant, sitejabber.com, a new website to rate the trustworthiness of other websites. An NSF grant funding EcoATM, a company commercializing an ATM to give out cash if you give them your old cell phone. That's totally a private sector, and yet we're funding that in an era when we have a $750 billion deficit this year and a $17 trillion debt. An NSF grant paying for participants' expenses to attend an annual snowmobile competition in Michigan through 2015. I don't think that's a priority when we're struggling to pay our bills. List of the Department of Agriculture grants, I will put those in the record. We're still spending $30 billion a year for 47 job training programs, that none of which have a metric on them. and all but 3, according to the Government Accounting Office, overlap one another. In other words, do the same thing. 20 federal programs across 12 different federal agencies for the study of invasive species. I think we should study invasive species, but I don't think we ought to have 12 agencies studying it. I think we ought to have one agency studying it, and we ought to concentrate the dollars so we get good value out of that. We're still sending unemployment checks to people that make more than $1 million a year. We have 15 different financial literacy programs, a new one being created by the Consumer Financial Protection Board. This is across 15 different agencies. We're spending millions on that. We're spending $1 million for NASA to test food that can be eaten on Mars 30 years from now. I wouldn't think that's a priority. $4 billion for 250 different grant programs at the Department of Justice, which the GAO says has the worst record of any agency in terms of monitoring their grants and the veracity and the compliance of those grants. $3 billion on 209 different programs for science, technology, engineering, and math across 13 different federal agencies. I think it's fine if we want to incentivize that. But do we really need over 200 programs to do that? No, we don't. But we've not addressed any of that. It's been no. We have the GAO out with a report, their third report this year. They'll come with another one next year, outlining at least $250 billion that could be saved by the federal government on duplicative services. In other words, multiple agencies doing the same thing, stepping on each other. Not one bill has come before this body that addresses that $250 billion expenditures that could be saved every year. Not one bill in this session of Congress. So when we have a fight over spending, and yet Congress is the very real problem that we're having the problems on spending, we need to look at what the real problem is. And the real problem is the failure to do our job. The failure to look at programs and see if they're effective. The failure to look at programs and see if they're truly a role for the federal government as far as the Constitution and as far as common sense. A failure to offer substantive changes or have the ability to offer substantive changes to those bills. So I'll conclude with one final remark. The Appropriations Committee did a good job this year, even though at higher levels above the Budget Control Act, of getting their bills in order. Only one of those bills was offered on the floor, and it was withdrawn when members of my caucus were not allowed to offer amendments. Because it wasn't going anywhere if we weren't allowed a minority right to offer an amendment to change an appropriation bill. So we're doing a continuous resolution to fund the government and handicapping the very employees that we're going to ask to make good decisions for our country. Because we won't pass appropriation bills on time. And we don't need a budget to pass appropriation bills because we have the Budget Control Act that spells out where we're going to be on discretionary spending for the next 10 years. We know what the levels are. And so consequently, we end up at an impasse over a continuing resolution that says we haven't done our job anyway. I think what Dr. David Brown says in his letter is quite accurate. There's a total lack of leadership in this city, sitting at the executive branch, in the House, and in the Senate. Only America can change that. I hope they do, and I yield the floor.